Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Coffee Break Chatters. Well, malapit na namang matapos yung Sunday, but before Sunday ends, I would like to go over this major update in the Millete case. Okay, so we are talking about one of the most well-known Filipino-American true crime cases dito sa United States. Again, this is the case of Maya and Larry Millete. And the reason why I wanted to cover this today is because there is again that major update. And after waiting for more than 5 years, a California jury has found Larry Millete guilty of the first degree murder of his wife, Maya. Okay, what's remarkable is that this conviction came even though Maya's body has never been found. And honestly, when I saw this verdict, I thought this will also be a good time to revisit yung entire case. Kasi if you've been following this story from the beginning, ang dami nang nangyari over the last 5 years. And if you are hearing about this case for the first time, don't worry, because before we talk about the guilty verdict and everything that happened inside the courtroom, we will do a quick recap from the beginning. Okay, because trust me, this case has almost everything you would expect in a true crime documentary. So there is this marriage that was quietly falling apart, a wife who was planning to leave, several online communications with self proclaimed spellcasters, searches involving poison, and then, of course, a missing mom of three, and eventually a murder conviction without a body ever being recovered. And throughout this video, guys, I'm going to separate facts from allegations. Kapag may sinabi yung prosecution, I will tell you that's the prosecution's theory. Tapos kapag may sagot naman ang defense, we'll talk about that too. And then we'll discuss what the jury ultimately decided on this case. I think yun yung pinaka-fair to cover a case like this. So let's go back to the beginning, because before Larry Millete became known across America because of this case, and before Maya's name appeared in the headlines, they were simply another typical Filipino American family trying to build a life together. Okay, so let's start with Maya. And I did a little bit of digging online on what's publicly available, of course. And I found some interesting details to humanize Maya before the case turns very tragic. Her full name is May Tabalansa, and of course, married name is Millete. So she is known as Maya. That is her nickname. She was born May of 1981. She was born in Ilocosur, Philippines. So fellow Ilocano in there. Tapos meron siyang names ng parents, but I don't feel comfortable adding them on this video. Okay. Maya was the fifth of six children, growing up in a, I would say, medium to large Filipino family, and that education, just like a lot of Filipino families, education was highly valued. At tapos mga around 1995, she was 13 years old at the time. She emigrated with her parents and her siblings to Honolulu, Hawaii, where the family started a new life. And this is actually one of the few things I found impressive about Maya, because according to family members, Maya was known to be the smart one in the family. Okay. Her sister said education was extremely important in their household, and Maya actually excelled in school from a very young age. So she attended the Admiral Arthur Radford High School in Hawaii, and then she later attended the University of Hawaii while Larry was serving in the Navy. And then after moving to California, she continued her education at the University of California in San Diego, and she earned a degree in international studies, and she graduated with honors. And I actually love this part of her story because she didn't stop her education after getting married. And then from there, she continued going to school while building a family. And that, I tell you, it's not easy to do. So, professionally, Maya built a very impressive career in the federal service. She worked as a civilian employee supporting the US Navy. Tapos, most recently, according to public profiles, she served as a contract specialist at the Naval Information Warfare Center after earlier roles supporting the Navy organizations in San Diego. So, she wasn't just working for the government. She had steadily advanced in her career over the years. She loved dancing. It looks like she enjoyed hiking and traveling. She seems very outgoing and energetic. She loves organizing family outings, always smiling in her pictures. And as per all of the witness testimonies, she really truly loved her three children. One thing that I found especially touching was that when Maya traveled back to the Philippines with her children, she reportedly filled backpacks with school supplies to give to children in local communities. And her family said she wanted her children to understand the importance of helping others and giving back. So Larry's background, on the other hand, is actually more interesting than most news reports make it seem. But I want to be very careful dahil there are few things that were confirmed through military records and yung what was discussed in court and few things that have been widely reported but involves juvenile records. So those are generally sealed. So I want to be very careful on that. Now, for his early life, Larry Millete, his full name is Larry J. Ibarreta Millete. And he was born in the early 1980s. Walang masyadong records. Public reporting indicates he was born in the Philippines as well. Was later also raised in Hawaii after his family moved there from San Diego. Yung dad niya is a retired US Navy service member with about 20 years of military service. So Larry grew up in a military family. Public reports states that in 1997 when Larry was 15 years old, he was allegedly arrested in connection with a gang-related stabbing in San Diego. He was taken into juvenile custody on an assault charge, but because it was a juvenile case, the official court records remains sealed and very very little information beyond those reports. And then afterwards his family relocated to Hawaii, reportedly hoping for a fresh start. Ngayon, how they met is one of the nicer parts of the story before everything went wrong. So when Larry moved to Hawaii as a teenager, he met Maya while they were both in high school and they married in 1999 when they were still very very young. Okay? Some accounts that I've seen say they first met while Maya was working at the McDonald's in Honolulu. So Larry enlisted in the United States Navy, US Navy in 1999, and he served on active duty from 2000 to 2005. He served as HM3 and worked primarily as an optician at the Naval Medical Center in San Diego. So he was not a combat veteran. During his service, he received several routine military awards, including Good Conduct Medal and National Defense Service Medal. So after leaving active duty, Larry continued working in the Navy community in civilian roles, while Maya also built her own civilian federal career. And then, of course, together they settled in Chula Vista, California. They started raising three children, and by the looks of it, they look like a stable middle class Filipino American family. Their neighbors and their family described them as normal family before Maya disappeared. So, diba, from the outside looking in, it looked like they had achieved what many immigrant families dream of, having a stable home, good careers, right? Healthy children, what we call the American dream. But according to testimonies that would later come out during the trial, their marriage had been under strain for some time. And eventually, si Maya, she reached a point where she wanted out of the marriage. And on what was presented in court, she actually shared with so many people close to her that she was planning to seek divorce. And for many Filipino viewers, we understand how difficult that decision can be dahil alam naman natin na sa culture natin, marriage is taken very, very seriously. Minsan, people stay in that marriage because of kids. Minsan, it's because of family expectations, because, of course, they're probably hoping things will eventually get better. So, deciding to leave a long marriage is rarely an overnight decision. Usually, matagal na pinag-iisipan yan. What no one could have imagined was that this decision would eventually become one of the biggest turning points in this murder investigation. So Larry apparently was not willing to accept that decision about the divorce, right? And when I first started reading about it, I honestly stopped for a second and I thought, wait, am I reading the right case? Because then investigators started showing discoveries that Larry had been communicating with online people who described themselves as spellcasters. Spellcasters, yun ba yung, hindi ko alam kung sa Pilipinas, mangkukulam ba yun or witchcraft? I don't really have in mind an actual uh, yung parang equivalent ng spellcasters sa tawag natin sa Pilipinas. But according to evidence presented during the trial, these weren't just one or two random messages. So there were multiple communications with people claiming they could perform spiritual rituals or love spells on Maya. Okay, now whether you personally believe in witchcraft or kulam or spiritual rituals, that's really not the issue here. Okay, the prosecution was not trying to prove that magic caused Maya's disappearance. Their point, of course, is totally different. They argued that these messages showed Larry's state of mind and how desperate he had become to stop Maya from leaving him. And according to prosecutors, the conversations actually changed over time. So at first, yung mga request niya is about saving the marriage, okay? Making Maya fall in love with him again, keeping the family together. Pero kalaunan, prosecutors presented different types of messages that they became much darker. They alleged that Larry began asking for rituals intended to stop Maya permanently, even discussing having her harmed. And those communications became one of the pieces of evidence that prosecution used to argue premeditation. And the defense disputed the prosecution's interpretation of those messages, of course. But honestly, that was one of the most disturbing parts of this case for me. Not because of the idea of spell casting itself, but because it suggested just how far someone might be willing to go when they feel like they're losing control of a relationship. And I want to stop here for just a moment because whether it's a husband, a wife, right, a boyfriend or girlfriend, love should never become control. Okay, there is a huge difference between fighting for your marriage and refusing to let the other person make their decision. That's something I think all of us can learn from this case. Another thing that really stood out during the trial for me was how Maya's family described her during those final weeks. Sabi nila she was making plans for her future. She was not talking about disappearing. She was not talking about starting over in secret. She was talking about moving forward with her life. So, talagang big difference yun. People who are planning a divorce usually prepare financially. They talk to family, right? They make arrangements for their children, babysitting kung wala sila doon at sila yung may custody sa mga bata. They don't just normally cut off every single person they love overnight. So according to the prosecutors, that's exactly what made Maya's sudden disappearance so suspicious. So at this point, investigators were still trying to figure out one simple question. Did she choose to leave or did something happen to her? Okay, and unfortunately, they were about to discover evidence that would push this case in a very different direction at that time. Because once the detectives started examining phone records niya, yung mga internet searches, mga surveillance camera, mga data sa vehicle, they began putting together a timeline that prosecutors later described as impossible to ignore. So, as days went by, right, the hope that Maya had simply walked away slowly began to fade. So she did not report to work, she wasn't receiving calls or text messages. There was no activity na nagsasuggest na she was starting a new life somewhere else. Kaya major red flag yun sa mga investigators. So Maya, think about it. Maya had a very good career with the Department of Defense. She was involved with her children's lives. She was very close with her family. Um, so if truly someone else is planning to leave a marriage, they usually still stay in contact with the people they love, like yung family nila, yung parents, siblings, sisters. They don't just disappear into thin air. So the detectives started treating this case as more than just a missing persons case. And one of the things they did was reconstruct Maya's final known moments at the time. Nag-interview sila ng mga relatives niya, yung friends, yung coworkers, yung mga neighbors nila, and anyone who may have spoken with her before she vanished. And at the same time, the investigators also started collecting digital evidence. Kasi syempre, nowadays, our phones, yung mga vehicles natin, even mga internet searches natin, like we said, can tell investigators a lot about what happened before and after a crime. One piece of evidence that caught their attention was the family's SUV. And the data recovered from the from the vehicle, it showed that it traveled hundreds of miles in the days after Maya disappeared. So far more than what investigators considered normal for that vehicle. So prosecutors later argued those unexplained trips were significant, while the defense, of course, disagreed with that conclusion again. Then, investigators reviewed surveillance footage from around the neighborhood, and one video in particular was very important sa kasong ito. So, it appeared to show Larry removing yung napakalaking chest freezer from the family home shortly after Maya disappeared. And now, by itself, getting rid of a freezer doesn't prove a crime, right? But people replace appliances all the time. And what investigators are looking is they're looking at the timing. Why now? And why so soon after Maya vanished? And this became another piece of the overall picture presented to the jury. Another detail that generated a lot of discussion during the trial involved the poison hemlock. And detectives found internet searches related to poison hemlock, and investigators also found poison hemlock growing at the Millete home. The prosecution argued this supported its theory that the killing had been planned in advance. Yun yung sinasabi nating premeditated. The defense responded that the evidence did not prove Maya had been poisoned and challenged the prosecution's interpretation. And this is what makes circumstantial cases so interesting. There's rarely one single piece of evidence where you can point tapos sasabihin mo, that's it. That's my evidence, right? Instead, there is dozens and dozens of pieces and each one may seem ordinary pagka titingnan mo lang na mag-isa. But as in group, then it looks like it raises this huge red flag. And investigator asked one question: do all these pieces fit together by coincidence, or do they tell one story? Meanwhile, of course, Maya's family refused to give up, and they organized searches, they spoke to media, they had vigils, they continued asking the public for help because at that point they still hoped that Maya would somehow be found alive. Hey, imagine being one of her children. Imagine being her mom or being her sister. Every morning, you're hoping for that person to walk through the front door. Every birthday, every holiday, right? Every family milestone, just waiting for someone who will never come home. And honestly, I think that that's truly one of the saddest parts of this case. It's not just the loss, just the uncertainty. And eventually, after months of collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses, investigators believed that they had enough to make an arrest. So, noong 2021, October 2021, Larry Millete was arrested and charged with the murder of Maya, again, even though her body had never been recovered. Now, if you think that the arrest was the hardest part, it really was not. The biggest challenge was still ahead of that. Okay, how do you convince 12 jurors that the murder happened when there is no body, no confession, and no eyewitnesses? So, as we conclude this video, Maya disappeared January of 2021. Tapos na-arrest si Larry later that same year, 2021. But the actual murder trial didn't begin until years later. And there's a lot of questions why, bakit ang tagal? Bakit kung marami na silang ebidensya na nakolekta, bakit hindi naumpisahan agad yung paglilitis? But the answer is because this wasn't your ordinary murder case. This was what lawyers call a no body homicide case. So, in other words, prosecutors believe a murder had taken place, but Maya's body had never been found. So, yung mga cases na like this, they are incredibly complex. So, both cases had to go through thousands of pages of reports, digital records, I would say phone data, surveillance videos, right? Search histories, witness interviews, expert opinions, and countless of other pieces of evidence. Tapos on top of that, there were numerous court hearings, mga legal motions na sinasabi natin, and evidentiary rulings before a jury was ever selected. So that's not unusual in major murder cases, especially one with this much circumstantial evidence. And I know it must have been really incredibly difficult for Maya's family to wait, right? Because imagine waiting for 5 years of not knowing where your loved one is, of not knowing if you'll ever get any answers, of having to relieve the pain every time there's another court hearing. But at the same time, that's how the American justice system works. The goal isn't just to get the conviction, the goal is to make sure the trial is fair. Whether we personally like the outcome or not, every person charged with a crime has what we call the constitutional right to prepare a defense. Now, here's an important legal concept too that you will hear in a lot of criminal cases. Yung sinasabi nilang burden of proof. So, hindi kailangang patunayan ng akusado na inosente siya. Instead, ang prosecution ang may responsibilidad na patunayan sa jury na guilty ang akusado. Hindi lang baka guilty. Hindi lang malamang ginawa niya. They have to prove that the case is beyond a reasonable doubt. Hindi ibig sabihin nito na kailangan nilang sagutin ang bawat maliliit na tanong, pero kailangan nilang magpakita ng evidence na magbibigay sa jury ng matibay na paniniwala na walang reasonable explanation na nagpapakita ng innocence. And that's a very high legal standard. And that's exactly why murder trials take so much preparation. And then now, when the trial finally began on this case, the prosecution had a very, very clear strategy. Since there was no body, they really couldn't deny on DNA evidence from the crime scene or medical examiner explaining the cause of death, right? Instead, they asked the jury to step back, look at the entire picture, not just one evidence, but all of the evidences put together. And then they pointed out Tamaya's plans to leave the marriage, yung mga online messages with the spellcasters, yung mga internet searches about poison hemlock, yung unusual mileage of the family SUV, and the surveillance footage showing the freezer being removed from the home. And the fact that Maya, a devoted mom and a federal employee, suddenly disappeared without contacting anyone she loved. So yung argument nila is very simple. Each piece by itself might not prove murder. Pero kapag samasamahin mo yung mga pieces ng evidence, they believed it told one consistent story. That Maya's disappearance was planned and Larry was responsible. Now, of course, again, meron yung defense, right? And they saw it differently. Yung mga attorney naman ni Larry, yung mga lawyers niya, they reminded the jury that suspicion is not the same as proof. Okay, they argued. Sorry guys, I have an emergency alert from the National Weather System. So I get I get alarmed on that one. Sorry about that. Okay. I got scared actually. Okay, where are we? So now of course the defense saw it differently, right? Larry's attorneys reminded the jury that suspicion is not the same as proof. Okay? Ang sabi nila, yung prosecution's case daw was built entirely on what they say is circumstantial evidence. Dahil walang eyewitness, walang confession, walang murder weapon. And perhaps the most important point is that Maya's body was never found. They argued that while circumstances were tragic and heartbreaking, the evidence still did not prove first degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt. And that is what I find fascinating about this trial. So the jury wasn't deciding whether Maya was missing because everyone agreed she was missing. But the jury wasn't also deciding whether something terrible probably happened to her because most people believed it did. The real question was more specific. Did the evidence prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that Larry Millete intentionally murdered Maya? And that's only one question the jury had to answer in this case. And after weeks of testimonies, they were heard from investigators, from forensic experts, again, family members, friends, and other witnesses. They reviewed hundreds of exhibits and listened to hours and hours of testimonies. Then the case finally was placed again on the hands of the 12 ordinary citizens. So just imagine being one of those jurors, right? You are not deciding a TV show. Hindi ka nagvo-vote sa social media, but you are deciding on someone's future. If you vote guilty, that person can spend the rest of his life in prison. Tapos kung hindi naman guilty, not guilty, there is a family that may feel they never received justice. Napaka-laking responsibility on the jurors' shoulders, right? But on July 9, mga kapatid, last week, July 9, 2026, the jury finally returned to the courtroom, and after more than 5 years, they announced their decision. is guilty. So Larry Millete was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Maya Millete. So para sa family ni Maya, this is an emotional moment, right? For years, they had searched for Maya, spoken to media, they attended court hearings, and they refused to let her story be forgotten. And the verdict presented justice under the law. But as I finished this case, covering this case, one thought kept coming back to me, right? Justice. And then, of course, closure. Justice and closure are not always the same thing. Because even after guilty verdict, Maya's children still don't know where their mom is, right? Her parents still don't have a gravesite to visit. Her siblings still don't know exactly what happened during those final moments. And that's why, even today, one question continues to haunt this case. Where is Maya Millete? Okay, so thank you so much mga kapatid for joining me as we walk through this case together. I hope this story reminds us, all of us, to value our loved ones and never ignore the signs that something isn't right. So thank you so much, and if you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you. Bye-bye.